Hi guys, Greg here. Today, exciting stuff. I'm going to talk about the music of Super Mario Odyssey. So I thought I'd do a series on each of the kingdoms in Super Mario Odyssey and how the music of that world adds to the theme that the world is going for. I actually did a degree in music and I thought, why not put that to good use? Bring my loves together. As always, if you found any of this interesting or entertaining, then you can please smash the subscribe button down there. Drop me a comment about other things you'd like to see me pick apart, maybe, if that's something you'd be interested in. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I love Super Mario Odyssey, with a host of interesting worlds to explore, each coming with a completely unique feel. To solidify each of the world's personas, they all come with their own distinct musical score, which further solidify their identities. In this series of videos, I want to pick apart each of the tracks that accompany the lands in Super Mario Odyssey and lay out some of the ways in which the composer has suited the music to the overarching theme of the world. I admit I've been a bit torn on who to pitch this sort of series to, but I'm going to assume that you have no sort of music theory knowledge. Let's go! So the first world in which Mario finds himself, in contrast to the later worlds of the game, is the reserved land of Bonnetown in Cap Kindom. This world is a sleepy, muted introduction to the game, and you'll notice the world itself is void of colour. Some of the later worlds in the game offer incredibly scenic backdrops, yet here the small area which we have access to is surrounded by clouds, and in the distance a dreary, seemingly endless grey cityscape. The music that scores this world matches this tone through sparse orchestration. When I say orchestration, I mean the way in which a composer chooses to deploy the instruments at their disposal to create a desired effect. When writing music for over 80 musicians or so, you can create a ton of different effects by selectively choosing to use just pockets of instruments around the orchestra. For a game that features some grandiose orchestral scores, the music for Bonnetown is incredibly light in texture. Texture in a musical sense can indeed be light or thick, and we can change the texture through a number of means, but I'd consider the main one to be how many distinct lines of music are being layered on top of each other, more on that later, and the timbre of the instruments being used. First fancy word of the vid then. Timbre is the tone or characteristics of a sound as distinct from its pitch and intensity. For example, we can take a look at the string family of instruments in which violin is the highest and double bass the lowest. Whilst the violin plays at a much higher pitch than the double bass, we can hear that they share a similar timbre. So imagine if I could play exactly the same pitch and volume on, say, a guitar and a trumpet. Even though both sounds would share the same pitch and intensity, they'd still sound very different due to the fact that one sounds like a trumpet and one sounds like a guitar. We use words like bright, warm, shrill, or round to describe timbre, and musicians can vary the timbre of their instrument by using performance techniques. In the opening of Bonnetown's score then, we see a selection of instruments whose timbres help create this thin and sparse texture that help match the world around us. If we take a look at the cello and violin lines in the first few bars, we see the word pizz above the music. This is an instruction to musicians and is short for pizzicato. Most musical directions for performers use Italian, just because a lot of early composers in the Western classical music scene were Italian and their directions just kind of stuck. Pizzicato directs string players to pluck the notes on their instrument rather than bowing them, and as such significantly changes the timbre of their instrument. And there could not be a more perfect example of this than in the first few bars of the Bonnetown score. The very first thing we hear is a B followed by an E in the cello part. A few bars later we see the indication for pizz in the cello part, and the same two pitches are played, albeit one octave higher. We can hear how bowing and plucking a string instrument can have a huge effect on the resulting texture of the music created. Shorter sounds mean more gaps in noise, which results in thin textures, and we see this knowledge being utilised in the other instrument choices here. The violins are also pizzicato for the entire intro. We see the celeste, which you may recognise from Harry Potter's Hedwig theme, often used for its soft, heavenly timbre. If the composer had chosen to use a glockenspiel here instead, it probably would have had much more of a presence, which is exactly what they were trying to avoid. The xylophone is probably the least resonant of the tuned percussion instruments. Being made of wood, it's actually incapable of sustained single notes. We see the composer making up for this by directing a tremolo on the longer note. Tremolo just means you go as the only way to make the xylophone sound for longer is to just keep hitting it. A triangle, famous for its lengthy tings, are muted here, which just involves holding onto the frame of the triangle, and this greatly shortens the resulting sounds. We see here that by being selective with their choice of instruments and altering timbre for the use of different performance techniques, the composer has dramatically thinned out the texture of the music to create a sparse and subdued score that reflects Bonnetown itself. Let's talk about the other way in which texture is influenced then, by the actual layering of musical lines. The majority of this score is what you'd call homophonic. If I sing by myself, like a billionaire mates, one melodic line, we'd call that having monophonic texture, as there's only one melodic idea going on. However, if I were to accompany my angelic voice with a piano accompaniment, I would now have a homophonic texture. Sure, the chords that accompany me might be nice, but they're not really a distinctive melodic idea in their own right. They're supporting my heroic effort at singing. This creates something that combined is a new, more developed composition. This is homophonic texture. There are some types of music where we don't have such a clear melody and accompaniment divide, however. Fugues, for example, feature multiple melodic lines intertwining with one another to create a very dense and busy music with what we'd call a polyphonic texture. In Bonnetown's score, there's only ever one melodic idea being presented at a time, so as to keep the music lightly textured. For example, the second theme of the piece introduces some flutes and clarinets. Here we can see dots above the pitches, which indicates to the musician to play staccato, another Italian term. This one means in a short style, rather than give the notes their full length. The flute and clarinets play the same melodic idea here a third apart. This close harmony keeps the theme light, and because they both play at the same time in the same rhythm, we can not only say this is homophonic, but also homorhythmic in texture. The answering phrase is hand to the xylophone. By spreading the theme out across the orchestra, the composer creates a sense of space instead of layering many voices on top of one another. Bringing these ideas of timbre and texture together then, in the final melodic idea of the piece we see bowed strings with melody. As discussed earlier, we can now hear that bowing does indeed give a much fuller texture to the music. But to maintain the lightness of the score, we see the string parts moving roughly at the same time so as to keep the music homorhythmic in texture, and without any other strong melodic ideas being presented, we can say the music is still homophonic. The accompaniment comes in the form of the lower strings, which still play pizzicato, as they are much more resonant and have a fuller timbre than their higher pitched string relatives. If they were to play bowed, they'd really start to beef up the texture of the music. The flutes and clarinets mirror this idea with short and spiky staccatissimo interjections. If they had doubled up on the melody here as well, we would have had a much thicker resulting texture. Bonnetown serves as a tentative introduction to the Super Mario Odyssey universe. A deep understanding of texture and timbre in the musical score certainly coincides with this idea. By keeping the world's aesthetic reserved and muted, the game sets the player up for an assault of the senses in its second world, made all the more exciting by the stark contrast. But that's for next video. We made it. I hope you enjoyed my first sort of foray into music analysis on YouTube. I had a good time. Anyone else? Anyone else have a good time? If you have any questions about anything that came up in today's video, drop a comment down below. I would love to talk to you about music and stuff. As always, please subscribe and all that good stuff. You can catch me on Twitch on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. And I shall see you all next week. Bye.